resting in local and action potential. Resting membrane potential is when a neuron is at rest and is ready to send a signal. The ICF has a value of negative 70 millivolts inside the cell. The plasma membrane resting potential, the ECF, and the ICF says that there is an electrical potential in the plasma membrane, or at the plasma membrane, this guy right here. And that the ICF has a value, again, of negative 70 millivolts. This states that the membrane has achieved its resting membrane potential. Also, there are sodium ions on the outside, the ECF, and potassium ions on the inside, the ICF. And again, the ICF is at negative 70 millivolts. It is said to make the plasma membrane polarized. The generation of electrical signals, the sodium and potassium ions, that move into and out of the ICF and travel along the plasma membrane are considered currents. The currents are a disruption to the membrane's resting potential and can be stimulated in many ways, such as light, chemical, change in temperature, so on and so forth. The pumps, which is this guy right here, there are sodium and potassium pumps which constantly use ATP in order to maintain resting potential. In order to send an electrical signal, the ions must diffuse across the membrane and to generate a current, which can be repeated. So there are sodium and potassium gates in the plasma membrane, which gives the ions a way to move across the membrane when a signal is desired. This guy is your gate. Oops. The gates are a membrane protein which are specific to certain substances. And these gates can be closed, which means they will not allow substances to pass through, and they can be open, which allows substances to pass through. While at rest, the neuron gates remain closed and the pumps are transmitting sodium ions out and potassium ions in. And each substance is staying right where it's been pumped. From where sodium ions sit, it is a positive charge. They sit in a positively charged fluid. Due to this, there is a very strong attraction to the ICF. Moving on to local potential. Local potential is when a dendrite is stimulated. Sodium gates will then open. The sodium ions will then diffuse into the ICF. The cations then change the negative 70 millivolts of a resting potential, making it more of a positive. The positive shift in this membrane potential is called depolarization. The open gates of the sodium and the diffusion of ions at the site of the stimulation into the ICF allows neighboring sodium gates to open. If the stimulation is strong enough, the current can travel through the plasma membrane of the soma and possibly reach the axon helix region. But we'll talk about that later. But this kind of signal is called a local potential. There are a few things about a local potential that you might want to know. Each one is graded. They vary in magnitude depending on the strength of the stimulus. The more stimulus, the more sodium gates open. The more sodium ions enter the ICF, which then depolarizes the membrane at a greater and greater degree. They are decrement. In other words, the current weakens the further away from the site of stimulation the neuron gets. They are reversible. If stimulus stops, the membrane returns right back to the resting potential. This happens because sodium gates close, and without the stimulation and the sodium pumps can put the sodium ions right back into the ECF. Action potential. Action potential is when a local potential is strong enough to reach the axon hillock. The axon hillock has 7 to 10 times the number of potassium gates than the soma and dendrites do. If the local potential is strong enough, once it has reached the axon hillock, it can create a bigger effect and change in the polarity and membrane potential. This strong signal is an action potential. Action potentials are also different from local potentials in the following ways. Action potentials follow an all or none law, which means if the local potential is strong enough to create an action potential, the action potential will occur at full strength. If the local potential is not strong enough, no action potential will happen. All this being the case, action potentials are not graded. They are non-decremental. They maintain full strength regardless of the distance to stimulus, and action potentials are irreversible. Once started, they can't be stopped. Kind of like the Hulk. The process of an action potential is when a local potential reaches the axon hillox, it starts to depolarize the axon hillox resting membrane potential of negative 17 millivolts. The local potential must be strong enough to open the sodium gates in the axon hillox and getting the membrane potential to reach the threshold in order to create an action potential, making the ICF go up to negative 55 millivolts. The many sodium gates begin to open in the membrane of the hillox once the threshold is reached. So that would be go from here. The sodium gates are then opened. Sodium gates go from ECF to ICF. The sodium ions from the ECF diffuse into the ICF, which depolarizes the membrane potential rapidly. If the ICF will go from negative 55 millivolts to 0 to plus 35 millivolts. And when the ICF is at plus 35 millivolts, which is the peak value of an action potential, the sodium gates then close. And the potassium gates then open. The potassium ions in ICF diffuse out and into the ECF. In this process, the membrane potential rapidly repolarizes, which means the voltages go back to negative. When the ICF reaches negative 70 millivolts again, the potassium gates then close. Once both potassium and sodium gates close, the pumps can then restore the cations back into the original locations. This allows the membrane to recover so that it can start all over again.